Hey guys, tonight we descend into the supposedly glorious but actually nightmarish world of medieval knight commanders, where honor, duty, and absolutely no concept of work-life balance collided in spectacular fashion. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me tell you, what we're diving into today makes modern middle management look like a spa retreat. Picture this: you living in an age where your career advancement depended on how well you could swing a sword while managing the medieval equivalent of a small corporation. Except your employees could literally stab you in the back. Your shareholders were bloodthirsty nobles who changed allegiances like modern people change Netflix passwords. And your office was whatever muddy battlefield you happened to be dying on that week. Let's be clear about something right off the bat. The Hollywood version of medieval knight commanders is about as accurate as a McDonald's commercial representing fine dining. We read talking about men who were essentially middle managers in an era where your performance review could literally end with your head on a spike, and where thinking outside the box meant figuring out creative ways to not die horribly while keeping everyone else from mutinying. To be fair, the title Knight Commander sounds impressive, doesn't it? It conjures images of noble warriors leading charges on white horses, inspiring loyalty through sheer charisma, and winning battles through tactical brilliance. The reality? These poor bastards were more like stressed-out project managers, trying to coordinate a group project where half the team wants to kill the other half the budget keeps. Getting cut and failure means not just getting fired. It means getting literally fired, as in burned alive. Think about your worst boss for a moment. Now imagine the boss has the legal right to execute you for insubordination, controls your housing, your food, and your family's welfare. And they're also probably clinically insane from generations of inbreeding and lead poisoning. Sound familiar? That was just Tuesday for a medieval knight commander. That's right, we're about to explore why being a knight commander in medieval times was essentially like being handed the keys to a flaming bus full of angry armed passengers and being told to drive it through a minefield, while everyone shouts contradictory directions and threatens to murder you if you take a wrong turn. Meanwhile, popular culture has sold us this romantic notion of chivalrous leaders gracefully commanding respect through noble bearing and inspiring speeches. The historical record, however, tells a different story, one filled with political backstabbing, economic nightmares, medical horrors, and the kind of workplace toxicity that would make modern HR departments weep into their ergonomic keyboards. By the end of this deep dive, you will all understand why Knight Commander was less of a prestigious title and more of a death sentence with better armor. We'll explore the political minefields they had to navigate, the impossible economic pressures they faced, the horrifying medical realities of their profession, and the personal costs that would make modern work-life balance advocates stage an intervention. If you thought your job was stressful, think again. At least when your boss is unreasonable, you don't have to worry about them challenging you to trial by combat or having you drawn and quartered for missing a deadline. And yet, thousands of men throughout medieval history took on this role, driven by ambition, duty, or sheer desperation. Still, before we dive into this carnival of medieval misery, it's worth understanding what exactly a knight commander was supposed to be. In theory, these were the elite military leaders of their age, men who had proven themselves in battle, demonstrated leadership capabilities, and earned the trust of their superiors. They were responsible for training and leading other knights, managing military campaigns, overseeing fortifications, and serving as the backbone of medieval military hierarchy. Of course, the gap between theory and practice in medieval times was roughly the size of the English Channel during a particularly nasty storm. The knight commander was expected to be simultaneously a warrior, a diplomat, an accountant, a logistics coordinator, a personnel manager, a spiritual leader, and a tactical genius. Oh, and they had to do all this while wearing 60 pounds of metal, riding a horse that cost more than most people's annual income, and managing subordinates who viewed backstabbing as a legitimate career advancement strategy. Let's be honest, we're essentially talking about medieval middle management with swords. And if that doesn't sound like a recipe for disaster, you've clearly never worked in middle management. The only difference is that when medieval middle managers failed, they didn't just get a bad performance review and a frozen salary. They got their heads removed from their shoulders, often in front of cheering crowds who treated executions like we treat sporting events. To be fair, some knight commanders did manage to achieve genuine success and leave lasting legacies. But for every legendary leader who earned their place in history books, there were dozens of forgotten souls who got chewed up by the brutal machinery of medieval politics and warfare. These are their stories, the untold tales of men who discovered that climbing the ladder of medieval success was like playing a game where the rules constantly changed. The other players cheated openly, and losing meant not just professional embarrassment but literal dismemberment. So buckle up, because we're about to take a journey through one of history's most thankless jobs, where the pay was terrible, the working conditions were lethal, and the retirement plan was basically try not to die before you re too old to hold a sword. Welcome to the wonderful world of medieval knight commanders, where every day was a good day to die, and most days, that's exactly what happened. Chapter 1. The Illusion of Glory. Let's start with the recruitment brochure, shall we? Picture the medieval equivalent of a glossy corporate pamphlet. Join the knights, see the world, meet interesting people, kill them, lead brave warriors into glorious battle, die horribly covered in your own blood. Of course, they left out that last part. The path to becoming a knight commander typically began in childhood, which should have been the first red flag. We were talking about a career track that started with sending 7-year-old boys away from their families to live with strangers and learn how to turn other human beings into hamburger meat. Modern child psychologists would have a collective aneurysm studying medieval knight training, but back then, it was considered character building. Sound familiar? It's like those modern parents who ship their kids off to elite boarding schools except instead of learning Latin and proper etiquette. These children were learning 17 different ways to kill someone with a pointy stick and the proper technique for removing an enemy's head while it was still attached to their body. That's right. The medieval education system for future knight commanders was essentially a 12-year program in professional violence, with minors in politics, economics, and how to look noble while covered in other people's blood. The curriculum included such cheerful subjects as siege warfare, battlefield medicine, which mostly consisted of try not to die, and advanced backstabbing, both literal and figurative. Meanwhile, parents were essentially gambling their sons' lives on the slim chance that they might survive long enough to achieve social mobility. It was like a medieval lottery system, except instead of buying tickets, you were offering up your child's future mental health and life expectancy. The odds weren't great, but hey, at least if your boy died in service, you got some social prestige out of the deal. By the time these young men reached their 20s and were eligible for command positions, they had been thoroughly indoctrinated into a system that valued honor over common sense, glory over survival, and looking good in armor over actually being effective in combat. They had spent over a decade learning to see warfare as the highest calling of noble men, without anyone bothering to mention the fine print. If you thought modern military recruitment was aggressive, think again. Medieval knight commanders weren't just signing up for a tour of duty. They were committing to a lifestyle that made modern special forces training look like a relaxing spa weekend. And unlike modern soldiers, they couldn't just finish their service and go home. Once you were in the knight game, you were in it until death, disability, or disgrace removed you from the field. And yet, the appeal was undeniable. In an age where social mobility was rarer than honest politicians, Becoming a knight commander was one of the few ways a man could elevate his family's status. It offered the promise of land, wealth, prestige, and political influence. The recruitment pitch was essentially, survive long enough, and you could become a medieval CEO, complete with your own territory and the right to boss other people around. Still, let's examine what that glorious promotion to Knight Commander actually entailed. Congratulations, you've survived your apprenticeship. Here's your reward. You now get to be responsible for the lives, equipment, training, and morale of anywhere from a dozen to several hundred other armed, dangerous, and frequently unstable men. Oh, and if any of them screw up, guess who gets blamed? That's right, you do. Of course, nobody mentioned during the recruitment process that being promoted to Knight Commander was like being handed the keys to a medieval startup, except your product was violence. Your market was constantly shifting political alliances, and your investors were nobles who could have you executed if quarterly returns weren't satisfactory. The job description was wonderfully vague. Lead knights in battle, maintain discipline, serve your lord faithfully, uphold the code of chivalry, and don't die embarrassingly. What they didn't tell you was that these responsibilities often contradicted each other spectacularly, and that the average career duration was measured in years, not decades. Let's be clear about the economic reality here. Becoming a Knight Commander meant taking on massive financial obligations that would make modern student loan debt look like pocket change. You needed to maintain your own equipment, which included not just armor and weapons, but also horses, servants, and all the logistics required to keep a small military unit functioning. The startup costs alone were enough to bankrupt most families. To be fair, there were potential rewards for success. A successful Knight Commander could earn land grants, noble titles, favorable marriages for their children, and the kind of social influence that modern people spend millions trying to buy through political donations. But the keyword here is successful, and in medieval warfare, success was often determined by factors completely outside your control. Meanwhile, the failure rate was astronomical. For every Knight Commander who achieved lasting success, there were dozens who died in their first major campaign, were crippled by battle injuries, fell victim to court politics, or simply discovered that they were temperamentally unsuited for a career that required equal parts warrior, diplomat, and accountant. By the 12th century, the role had become so complex that Knight Commanders needed skills in everything from military engineering to international diplomacy. They were expected to be experts in siege warfare, cavalry tactics, logistics, personnel management, financial planning, and political maneuvering. It was like expecting a modern middle manager to also be a Navy SEAL, a diplomat, an accountant, and a therapist, all while someone was actively trying to kill them. If you thought the Peter Principle was bad in modern corporations, imagine it in the system where incompetent managers didn't just get promoted to their level of incompetence. They got promoted to their level of incompetence while wearing 60 pounds of metal and being shot at with crossbows. And yet, the mythology persisted. Every generation of young nobles heard the same stories of glorious victories, heroic leadership, and noble sacrifice. They saw the survivors who had achieved success and status without fully comprehending the carnage that had cleared the field for those few triumphant examples. Still, some did make it work. The successful Knight Commanders were genuinely impressive individuals who managed to navigate the impossible complexity of their role while surviving the constant attempts on their lives, both literal and figurative. They were the medieval equivalent of Fortune 500 CEOs, except their business was war and their competition was literally trying to murder them. Of course, even success came with a price. The psychological toll of commanding men in medieval warfare was something that nobody talked about, but everyone experienced. Modern military personnel have access to psychological support and understanding of PTSD. Medieval Knight Commanders were expected to simply man up and deal with the trauma of watching friends die horribly while making decisions that sent other people as sons to equally horrible deaths. The successful ones developed coping mechanisms that ranged from religious fanaticism to alcoholism to what we would now recognize as dissociative disorders. They learned to compartmentalize the horror, to see their subordinates as chess pieces rather than human beings, and to make peace with the fact that their primary skill was organizing and implementing mass violence. Let us be honest. The entire system was designed to produce functional psychopaths who could make life and death decisions without being paralyzed by empathy or moral consideration. The Knight Commander who spent too much time thinking about the humanity of his enemies or the families of his fallen subordinates was a Knight Commander who wouldn't last long in the brutal calculus of medieval warfare. To be fair, this wasn't necessarily a character flaw in the men themselves. They were products of a system that required certain psychological adaptations for survival. The alternative to becoming emotionally hardened was becoming emotionally destroyed, and destroyed men couldn't protect the people depending on them for leadership and security. Meanwhile, the families of these Knight Commanders paid their own price. The wives who watched their husbands transform from idealistic young men into hardened killers. The children who grew up with fathers who were either absent on campaign or present, but emotionally unavailable due to trauma. The parents who sent bright, enthusiastic sons off to war and got back, if they got anything back at all, hollow-eyed strangers who drank too much and woke up screaming in the night. By the time a man had survived long enough to become an experienced Knight Commander, he had typically seen more death, suffering, and horror than most modern people encounter in a lifetime of war movies. He had made decisions that resulted in the deaths of hundreds or thousands of other human beings. He had survived situations where luck was often more important than skill, and where the margin between victory and catastrophic defeat was often measured in heartbeats. If you thought modern executives faced high-pressure situations, think again. When a modern CEO makes a bad decision, shareholders lose money and people get fired. When a medieval Knight Commander made a bad decision, people got dead, and one of those people was likely to be him. And yet, they kept signing up. Generation after generation of young men looked at the survivors, heard the stories of glory and honor, and convinced themselves that they would be different. They would be the ones to beat the odds, to achieve lasting success, to write their names in history through valor and leadership. Still, for every legendary name we remember from medieval history, there are thousands of Knight Commanders whose stories ended in unmarked graves on forgotten battlefields. They were the ones who discovered that glory is often indistinguishable from disaster, and that the difference between a heroic last stand and a pointless waste of life is mostly determined by who wins the battle and gets to write the history books. Of course, even this grim reality doesn't fully capture the day-to-day misery of the job. We've been talking about the big picture, the life and death stakes, the psychological trauma, the economic pressures. But what about the mundane, grinding difficulties of actually doing the job? What about the politics, the logistics, the personnel management nightmare of trying to maintain discipline among a group of armed sociopaths who considered murder a legitimate form of conflict resolution? That, my friends, is where things get really interesting. Because if the grand sweep of a Knight Commander's career was a tragedy, the daily reality was often a farce. A bloody, expensive, occasionally lethal farce, but a farce nonetheless. Chapter 2. Politics and Backstabbing. Let's talk about medieval office politics, shall we? Imagine your most toxic workplace. Multiply the dysfunction by about 1,000, give everyone swords, and remove all the modern legal protections that prevent your coworkers from literally murdering you for a promotion. Congratulations. You just imagine the daily reality of a Knight Commander trying to navigate court politics. Sound familiar? It's exactly like modern corporate backstabbing, except instead of undermining your quarterly report, your colleagues were undermining your actual spine with actual knives. That's right, Knight commanders had to master the delicate art of medieval networking, which was basically a cross between Game of Thrones and a particularly vicious episode of The Office. Except Dwight Schrute would have been considered a model of restraint and professional courtesy by medieval standards. Meanwhile, the organizational chart of a medieval court looked like it had been designed by someone having a psychotic break while playing three-dimensional chess. Everyone reported to everyone else. Nobody's authority was clearly defined, and the whole system ran on a combination of personal loyalty, bribery, blackmail, and the occasional strategic assassination. By the 12th century, a knight commander's success depended less on his ability to win battles and more on his skill at navigating the labyrinthine politics of feudal hierarchy. You needed to know which nobles were sleeping with each other's wives, which bishops were embezzling from the church treasury, which merchants were bribing which officials, and which of your fellow commanders were planning to stick a dagger between your shoulder blades at the next feast. If you thought keeping track of office gossip was exhausting, think again. Medieval court intrigue was like a soap opera written by someone with severe paranoid delusions and a detailed knowledge of medieval torture techniques. The plot twists involved actual plots. The character development included character assassination, both figurative and literal. And the season finales usually featured someone's head being separated from their body in front of a cheering crowd. And yet, you couldn't simply ignore the politics and focus on your military duties. A knight commander who tried to stay out of court intrigue was like a modern executive who tried to stay out of email. Technically possible, but professionally suicidal. The political game wasn't optional. It was the game, and military prowess was just one of the pieces on the board. Still, let's examine the specific challenges of managing medieval military personnel. Imagine trying to run a modern corporation where every employee was armed, trained in violence, legally permitted to settle disputes through combat, and culturally encouraged to see honor as more important than life. Now imagine that your HR department consisted of whoever was brave enough to get between angry knights before they killed each other. Of course, traditional management techniques were somewhat limited when your subordinates could legally challenge your authority through trial by combat. The modern approach of managing up and down became a literal description of the hierarchical relationships. You managed up by keeping your superiors happy, enough not to have you executed. And you managed down by keeping your subordinates just satisfied enough not to mutiny and murder you in your sleep. Let's be clear about the chain of command in medieval military units. In theory, it was simple. The Lord gave orders to the knight commander, who gave orders to the knights, who gave orders to the men-at-arms, who actually did the fighting and dying. In practice, it was like a game of telephone played by people with severe personality disorders and access to weapons of mass destruction. To be fair, some knight commanders did develop effective leadership styles that managed to inspire genuine loyalty and maintain discipline. But these were the exceptions, and their methods would probably be considered war crimes by modern standards. The most effective medieval military leaders were often the ones who could project just the right amount of barely controlled psychopathy, enough to keep their men in line, not so much that they scared away potential allies. Meanwhile, the concept of team building took on a rather different, meaning when your team was a collection of professional killers with hair-triggered tempers and a cultural obsession with personal honor. Medieval military units bonded through shared trauma, mutual threat, and the knowledge that their survival depended on the competence and loyalty of the psychopaths standing next to them. By the 13th century, knight commanders had to deal with increasingly complex military technology, changing tactical doctrines, and the integration of different types of fighting units. They were managing not just knights but also crossbowmen, pikemen, siege engineers, cavalry units, and various mercenary companies, each with their own traditions, loyalties, and ideas about acceptable behavior in civilized warfare. If you thought modern matrix management was confusing, Imagine trying to coordinate between units that spoke different languages, followed different military traditions, worshipped different gods, and considered each other subhuman barbarians worthy only of death and dismemberment. The United Nations has nothing on the diplomatic challenges faced by a knight commander, trying to keep his multicultural army from turning into a multicultural massacre. And yet, somehow, it worked. Not well, and not consistently, but medieval armies did manage to function as military units rather than simply disintegrating into armed mobs. This was largely due to the knight commanders, who figured out how to balance the competing demands of their impossible job while keeping everyone pointed in roughly the same direction. Still, the psychological toll was enormous. A knight commander had to maintain the respect of subordinates, who were constantly looking for signs of weakness, the confidence of superiors, who were constantly questioning his competence, and the loyalty of allies, who were constantly calculating whether betrayal might be more profitable than friendship. Of course, all of this political and managerial complexity existed on top of the basic challenge of not getting killed in battle. It wasn't enough to be a skilled diplomat, a competent administrator, and a charismatic leader. You also had to be genuinely effective at the core business of medieval knight commanders, which was organizing and implementing violence on an industrial scale. The successful knight commanders were those rare individuals who could seamlessly transition from negotiating a complex supply contract to leading a cavalry charge, from mediating a dispute between subordinates to making split-second tactical decisions while arrows were whistling past their heads. They were, in modern terms, the ultimate multitaskers, except their multitasking involved activities that would give modern HR departments collective nervous breakdowns. Let's be honest about the interpersonal skills required for medieval military leadership. You needed to be simultaneously intimidating enough to maintain discipline, charismatic enough to inspire loyalty, diplomatic enough to navigate court politics, ruthless enough to make hard decisions, and empathetic enough to understand the motivations of your subordinates. It was like being required to be Machiavelli, Alexander the Great, and Mr. Rogers all at the same time. To be fair, most knight commanders weren't actually this versatile. They specialized in one or two aspects of the job and tried to delegate or avoid the areas where they were weaker. The political operators focused on court intrigue and left the actual fighting to subordinates. The military tacticians focused on battlefield command and tried to avoid political entanglements. The charismatic leaders inspired fierce loyalty, but often lacked the strategic thinking required for long-term success. Meanwhile, the medieval promotion system virtually guaranteed that many knight commanders would be in over their heads. Military promotion was based on a combination of family connections, political loyalty, battlefield performance, and pure dumb luck. There was no systematic evaluation of leadership potential, no management training programs, and no gradual introduction to increasing levels of responsibility. By the time most knight commanders realized they were completely unqualified for their position, they were already responsible for the lives of dozens or hundreds of men and making decisions that could affect the outcome of major military campaigns. It was like promoting someone from entry level to senior management based solely on their ability to use Excel, then being surprised when they struggled with strategic planning and personnel management. If you thought imposter syndrome was bad in modern corporate environments, imagine experiencing it while wearing armor and making decisions that determine who lives and who dies in the next battle. The psychological pressure of knowing that your incompetence could result in the horrible deaths of men who trusted you to lead them competently was enough to drive anyone to drink, religion, or madness, and most knight commanders dabbled in all three. And yet, the system persisted because, despite its obvious flaws, it generally produced enough competent leaders to keep medieval armies functioning. The high failure rate was simply accepted as the price of doing business in an era where human life was considered cheap and leadership positions were viewed as inherently risky. Still, for every knight commander who cracked under the pressure, there was usually someone ready to step into his position. The medieval military hierarchy was like a shark tank. If you showed weakness, someone else would immediately move to take your place. And the process of replacement often involved literal predation. Of course, even the successful knight commanders paid a personal price for their professional achievements. The skills that made someone effective at medieval military leadership, the ability to make life and death decisions, quickly to inspire men through fear and charisma to navigate complex political situations, while maintaining focus on military objectives, were not necessarily skills that translated well to peacetime activities or healthy personal relationships. Many knight commanders found that they had become so adapted to the high-stakes, high-violence environment of medieval warfare that they struggled to function in normal social situations. They were like military specialists who had become so focused on their narrow area of expertise that they had lost the ability to relate to people who didn't share their professional obsessions with death and destruction. Let us be clear, we were talking about individuals who had spent years developing expertise in subjects that most modern people can't even think about without experiencing psychological distress. These were men who could discuss the most effective techniques for breaching castle walls, or the optimal formation for a cavalry charge, with the same casual competence that modern professionals might discuss quarterly budget projections or marketing strategies. To be fair, this specialization was necessary for survival in their chosen profession. Medieval warfare was complex enough that half measures and amateur approaches usually resulted in rapid death or career-ending failure. The knight commanders who succeeded were those who embraced the full implications of their role and developed the psychological tools necessary to function effectively in an environment of constant violence and political instability. Meanwhile, their families and personal relationships suffered from their professional focus. A man who had learned to see every social interaction as a potential threat, every political conversation as a possible trap, and every display of vulnerability as an invitation to exploitation, was not necessarily someone who could easily maintain warm, trusting relationships with spouses, children, and friends. By the end of their careers, many knight commanders had become functional sociopaths, not because they were inherently evil, but because their professional environment had rewarded the suppression of empathy and the cultivation of strategic thinking that treated other human beings as resources to be managed rather than people to be cared about. If you thought modern executive burnout was concerning, imagine the psychological state of someone who had spent decades making decisions about who should live and who should die, while constantly managing the threat of political betrayal and violent death. The wonder isn't that medieval knight commanders often developed serious psychological problems. The wonder is that any of them remained even marginally functional as human beings. And yet, somehow, many of them did. They found ways to compartmentalize the different aspects of their lives, to maintain some semblance of normal human relationships while excelling at a profession that required them to regularly engage in activities that would traumatize most modern people. They were, in their own way, remarkable examples of human adaptability and resilience. Still, the cost was always there, just below the surface. The successful knight commanders were those who had learned to function despite carrying psychological burdens that would crush most people. They had found ways to live with the knowledge of the things they had done, the decisions they had made, and the prices they had paid for their professional achievements. Chapter 3. The Economics of War. Let's talk money, because nothing says glorious military leadership quite like discovering that your heroic career in medieval warfare is actually an elaborate financial pyramid scheme designed to separate you from every penny you ever earn plus several pennies you haven't earned yet and probably never will. Sound familiar? It's exactly like those modern business opportunities that promise unlimited earning potential while requiring massive upfront investments and ongoing expenses that somehow always exceed your income. Except instead of selling overpriced vitamins to your friends and family, you were selling death and destruction to whoever your lord happened to dislike that particular season. That's right, being a knight commander was like running a small business where your product was violence, your overhead included feeding and equipping a small army. Your market was constantly shifting due to political instability, and your competitors were literally trying to kill you and steal your customers. Meanwhile, the medieval economy operated on principles that would make modern financial advisors require intensive therapy. The entire feudal system was essentially a giant Ponzi scheme where everyone owed military service to someone above them in exchange for land and protection. And the whole thing depended on a constant supply of new wars to generate the wealth needed to keep everyone happy. By the time you achieved the rank of Knight Commander, you had typically invested 15 to 20 years and a small fortune in equipment, training, and political networking. But congratulations! Your reward for this investment was the opportunity to invest even more money in an even riskier venture with even less certain returns. If you thought modern student loan debt was crushing, think again. The financial obligations of a medieval knight commander made modern graduate school look like a sound investment strategy. At least modern students can discharge their debt through bankruptcy. Medieval knight commanders could only discharge their obligations through death. And even then, their heirs often inherited the financial responsibilities, along with whatever remained of the estate. And yet, the recruitment brochure, if such things had existed, would have focused entirely on the potential rewards while glossing over the actual costs. Join the knighthood, earn land grants, achieve noble status, marry above your station. What they didn't mention was that most knight commanders spent more money maintaining their position than they ever earned from it. Still, let's break down the actual economics of medieval military leadership. First, there was the equipment. A knight commander needed not just his own armor, weapons, and horses, but also backup equipment for when the originals were damaged, destroyed, or stolen. Medieval warfare was hard on hardware, and replacement costs were astronomical by the standards of the time. Of course, we're not just talking about personal equipment. A knight commander was responsible for maintaining the gear of his subordinates, purchasing supplies for extended campaigns, and ensuring that his unit was properly fed, housed, and equipped for whatever military adventure they were currently pursuing. It was like being required to personally fund a small corporation dedicated to organized violence. Let's be clear about the scale of these expenses. A single suit of high-quality medieval armor cost approximately the same as a modern luxury car, and that was just for one person as protection. Multiply that by the number of knights under your command. Add in weapons, horses, fodder, food, transportation, lodging, and all the other necessities of medieval military life, and you're looking at expenses that would bankrupt most modern small businesses. To be fair, there were theoretically ways to make money as a knight commander. Successful military campaigns could result in loot, ransom payments, land grants, and other financial rewards. But these potential profits were offset by the enormous costs of the campaigns themselves, and the majority of military ventures ended in financial loss even when they achieved their strategic objectives. Meanwhile, the medieval accounting system was designed by people who apparently believed that mathematics was a form of dark magic best left to specialists. Record-keeping was haphazard, contracts were vague, and the legal framework for resolving financial disputes was basically trial by combat, winner takes all. It was like trying to run a modern business using accounting principles developed by people who thought double-entry bookkeeping was unnecessarily complicated. By the 13th century, the financial complexity of medieval military operations had reached levels that would challenge modern corporate accountants. Knight commanders had to manage budgets that included everything from fodder for war horses to bribes for corrupt officials, from ransoms for captured enemies to compensation for the families of fallen subordinates. If you thought modern business financing was complicated, imagine trying to secure funding for a military campaign in an era where banking was considered morally questionable and interest rates were often determined by religious authorities rather than market forces. Knight commanders had to be creative in finding ways to finance their operations, and creativity in medieval finance often involved activities that would land modern business people in federal prison. And yet, the system somehow functioned well enough to support centuries of medieval warfare. This was largely because the financial risks were distributed across multiple levels of the feudal hierarchy, with everyone from peasant farmers to kings contributing to the collective military budget, whether they wanted to or not. Still, individual knight commanders bore a disproportionate share of the financial burden relative to their potential rewards. They were essentially middle managers in a system where the profits flowed upward to the nobility, while the costs flowed downward to the people actually doing the work and taking the risks. Of course, there were knight commanders who did achieve genuine financial success. These were typically individuals who combined military competence with entrepreneurial skill, political connections, and an extraordinary amount of luck. But for every knight commander who retired wealthy, there were dozens who died in debt, leaving their families financially ruined and socially disgraced. The successful ones understood that medieval military leadership was as much about financial management as it was about battlefield tactics. They learned to treat their military units as business enterprises, their campaigns as investment opportunities, and their subordinates as both human resources and financial assets that needed to be managed for optimal return on investment. Let's be honest about what this meant in practical terms. A financially successful knight commander was someone who had learned to calculate the monetary value of human life, to make strategic decisions based on cost-benefit analysis that included the price of replacing dead soldiers, and to view warfare as a form of armed commerce, where the goal was to generate profit through the systematic application of violence. To be fair, this wasn't necessarily a moral failing on the part of individual knight commanders. They were operating within an economic system that required them to think in these terms for their own survival and the survival of the men under their command. The alternative to cold financial calculation was often bankruptcy, disgrace, and abandonment by the political and military establishment that had initially supported their careers. Meanwhile, the families of knight commanders paid their own financial price for their relatives' career choice. The wives who had to manage household budgets that were constantly strained by military expenses. The children whose inheritance was mortgaged to pay for their father's latest campaign. The extended family members who found themselves responsible for debts they had never agreed to incur. By the time a knight commander retired, assuming he lived long enough to retire, he had typically spent a lifetime juggling financial obligations that would challenge modern corporate CFOs. He had learned to manage complex cash flows, negotiate with suppliers who might stab you if you fell behind on payments, and maintain solvency, while funding operations that consumed resources at rates that would make modern defense contractors weep with envy. If you thought managing a modern household budget was stressful, imagine trying to balance the books when your monthly expenses included things like replacement horses for the ones that got shot full of arrows, bribes for corrupt customs officials, and funeral costs for subordinates who died horribly while following your orders. The medieval equivalent of QuickBooks would have needed a category for blood money and a depreciation schedule for human life. And yet, the most financially devastating aspect of a knight commander's career wasn't the predictable expenses, it was the unpredictable ones. Medieval warfare was full of hidden costs that could destroy even the most carefully planned budget. Your lord decides to extend a siege by 6 months. Congratulations, you just quadrupled your food and supply costs. The enemy burns your supply train? Hope you've got enough reserves to re-equip your entire unit from scratch. Still, some knight commanders did develop sophisticated strategies for managing these financial risks. They diversified their revenue streams, maintained strategic reserves, and developed networks of suppliers and financiers who could provide emergency support when campaigns went over budget. These were essentially medieval venture capitalists, except their business model involved considerably more bloodshed than modern private equity. Of course, even the most financially savvy knight commanders were vulnerable to the broader economic instabilities of medieval society. Plagues could devastate the tax base that funded military operations. Political upheavals could invalidate existing contracts and agreements. Changes in military technology could make expensive equipment obsolete overnight. Climate change could ruin harvests and create famines that made it impossible to feed armies in the field. The smart knight commanders learned to read these broader economic trends and adjust their strategies accordingly. They understood that successful military leadership required not just tactical skill, but also economic intelligence, financial planning, and the ability to adapt quickly when market conditions change dramatically. Let's be clear about the psychological impact of this constant financial stress. Modern research shows that money problems are one of the leading causes of anxiety, depression, and relationship difficulties. Now imagine experiencing that level of financial pressure while also dealing with the life and death responsibilities of military command, the political pressures of feudal hierarchy, and the physical dangers of medieval warfare. To be fair, some knight commanders seemed to thrive under this kind of pressure. They were natural entrepreneurs who enjoyed the challenge of building and managing military enterprises under extremely difficult conditions. But for every knight commander who found financial success energizing, there were many more who found it soul-crushing and professionally destructive. Meanwhile, the economic demands of knightly service were becoming increasingly incompatible with the traditional values of medieval chivalry. The code of knightly honor emphasized generosity, loyalty, and service to others, values that were often at odds with the hard-nosed business practices required for financial survival in medieval military markets. By the 14th century, this tension had created a generation of knight commanders who were essentially living double lives. In public, they maintained the traditional facade of noble service and chivalrous behavior. In private, they operated like medieval hedge fund managers, constantly calculating risks and returns, managing portfolios of military assets, and making decisions based on profit margins rather than honor codes. If you thought modern corporate culture created ethical conflicts, imagine trying to reconcile the idealistic values of medieval chivalry with the brutal realities of military economics. Knight commanders found themselves caught between cultural expectations that demanded selfless service and economic necessities that required ruthless self-interest. And yet, this contradiction wasn't necessarily seen as a problem by medieval society. The feudal system had always been based on the assumption that military service could be both morally noble and economically profitable. The fact that these two goals were often mutually exclusive was simply another challenge that successful knight commanders were expected to navigate. Still, the financial pressures did create perverse incentives that often worked against military effectiveness. Knight commanders who were struggling financially had strong incentives to prolong conflicts, inflate expenses, and prioritize profitable activities over strategically important ones. The most economically rational decision was often the worst military decision. Of course, the lords and kings who employed knight commanders were well aware of these incentive problems, which led to increasingly complex contractual arrangements and oversight mechanisms. By the late medieval period, military service contracts had become legal documents that would challenge modern corporate lawyers, with detailed specifications for everything from equipment standards to performance metrics. The successful knight commanders learned to work within these contractual frameworks while still maintaining enough flexibility to adapt to changing battlefield conditions. They became experts at managing not just their military operations, but also their relationships with the bureaucratic apparatus that funded and regulated medieval military service. Let's be honest, By the end of the medieval period, being a knight commander required skills that had very little to do with the romantic ideals of knighthood and chivalry. The job had evolved into something that was part military officer, part business executive, part political operator, and part financial analyst. The guys who succeeded were those who could seamlessly integrate all these different skill sets while maintaining the appearance of traditional knightly virtue. To be fair, this evolution wasn't entirely negative. The knight commanders who learned to think strategically about economics and politics often became more effective military leaders because they understood the broader context within which military operations took place. They could anticipate supply problems, predict political complications, and plan campaigns that were both militarily sound and economically sustainable. Meanwhile, the financial sophistication of late medieval knight commanders contributed to broader economic developments that helped lay the groundwork for modern capitalism. These men were pioneers in military contracting, logistics management, and risk assessment. Their innovations in military finance helped create the economic infrastructure that would eventually support much larger and more complex military operations. By the time the medieval period was drawing to a close, the most successful knight commanders were operating what amounted to military consulting companies. They had developed expertise that could be applied to different conflicts and different employers. They had created professional networks that spanned multiple kingdoms and political systems. They had established financial practices that allowed them to operate independently of traditional feudal obligations. If you thought modern military contractors were a recent innovation, think again. Late medieval knight commanders were essentially the original military entrepreneurs, developing business models that would be recognizable to modern defense industry executives. The main differences were the technology they used and the legal framework within which they operated, not the fundamental economic logic of their enterprises. And yet, even the most successful knight commanders never completely escaped the fundamental contradiction between their economic interests and their supposed moral obligations. They were trapped in a system that required them to treat warfare as a business, while maintaining the pretense that they were motivated by higher ideals of service and honor. Still, most of them found ways to live with this contradiction. They convinced themselves that financial success allowed them to be more effective in their service to their lords and their followers. They rationalized their business practices as necessary evils that enabled them to fulfill their higher duties. They developed philosophical frameworks that allowed them to reconcile profit motives with service ideals. Of course, not everyone bought into these rationalizations. By the late medieval period, there was growing criticism of knight commanders, who seemed more interested in personal enrichment than in traditional knightly virtues. This criticism contributed to the broader cultural shifts that would eventually lead to the decline of the medieval knightly system and its replacement by more modern forms of military organization. The knight commanders who thrived in this transitional period were those who could adapt to changing expectations while maintaining their core competencies. They learned to present themselves as both traditional knights and modern military professionals, depending on what their audience expected to see. Let us be clear, we were talking about individuals who had mastered one of the most complex career tracks in human history. They had succeeded in a profession that required expertise in violence, politics, economics, and human psychology, all while operating in an environment where failure often meant death and success never guaranteed security. To be fair, the skills they developed often transferred well to other areas of medieval life. Former knight commanders became successful merchants, diplomats, administrators, and even religious leaders. The same abilities that made someone effective at managing military operations, strategic thinking, leadership skills, financial acumen, political savvy, were valuable in many different contexts. Meanwhile, their contribution to medieval society extended far beyond their military service. They were often among the most educated and sophisticated individuals in their communities, bringing knowledge and skills acquired through their military careers to civilian pursuits. They served as bridges between the military and civilian worlds, helping to transfer innovations and ideas across different sectors of medieval society. By the end of their careers, the successful knight commanders had typically accumulated not just wealth and social status, but also a form of cultural capital that was valued throughout medieval society. They were men whose opinions were sought on a wide range of subjects, whose endorsement could make or break other people's careers, and whose networks of contacts could be leveraged for purposes that had nothing to do with military operations. If you thought modern professional networking was important, imagine operating in a society where your personal relationships literally determined your survival prospects and your family's future security. Knight commanders became masters of relationship management out of sheer necessity, and these skills served them well in all their endeavors. Chapter 4. Medieval Medical Care. Let's discuss the healthcare benefits of medieval knighthood, shall we? Spoiler alert, there weren't any. Being a knight commander in medieval times was like signing up for the world's most dangerous job, while also volunteering for medical experiments conducted by people who thought bloodletting was a cure-all, and wash your hands was a radical new concept that might catch on someday. Sound familiar? It's exactly like modern extreme sports, except instead of choosing to risk your life for fun, you were contractually obligated to risk your life for feudal politics, and instead of modern emergency medicine to patch you up afterward, you got medieval barber surgeons who were equally qualified to cut your hair, perform surgery, and prepare your funeral arrangements. That's right. Medieval knight commanders had a life expectancy that made being a test pilot during the early days of aviation look like a safe career choice. The average knight commander who survived long enough to see real combat could expect to collect an impressive array of scars, missing body parts, and chronic conditions that would give modern orthopedic surgeons nightmares and job security for life. Meanwhile, the medieval understanding of anatomy was based on theories that had been developed by people who weren't allowed to dissect human bodies, and therefore had to guess what was inside based on what they found when they cut open animals. This led to some fascinating misconceptions about human physiology that made medieval medical treatment roughly as effective as modern homeopathy, but considerably more painful. By the time you achieved knight commander status, you had typically already survived numerous training injuries that would have ended the career of any sensible person. Broken bones that had healed badly joint damage from wearing heavy armor and various cuts punctures, and bruises that had left permanent marks were considered normal. Occupational hazards like carpal tunnel syndrome for modern office workers, except considerably more disfiguring and life-threatening. If you thought modern workplace safety regulations were strict, think again. Medieval knights operated in an environment where the primary safety equipment was a metal suit that weighed as much as a small motorcycle and offered about the same level of mobility. Occupational safety and health administration inspectors would have taken one look at a medieval battlefield and immediately shut down the entire operation pending a complete review of safety protocols. And yet, armor was actually the advanced safety technology of its time. The knight commanders who could afford high-quality armor had a significant survival advantage over those who had to make do with cheaper alternatives. But even the best medieval armor was essentially a mobile iron maiden that protected you from some injuries while making you vulnerable to others. Still, let's examine the specific medical challenges faced by knight commanders. First, there were the obvious battle injuries: cuts, punctures, broken bones, and traumatic amputations that resulted from direct combat with weapons specifically designed to cause maximum damage to human bodies. These were the dramatic injuries that got attention in medieval chronicles and modern movies. Of course, the dramatic injuries were only part of the story. Knight commanders also dealt with a constant stream of less glamorous medical problems, that were often more debilitating than battlefield wounds. Chronic back pain from wearing heavy armor, joint disorders from the repetitive stress of swordplay, hearing loss from being repeatedly hit in the head with metal objects, respiratory problems from breathing in smoke, dust, and other battlefield contaminants. Let's be clear about the quality of medieval medical care available to injured knight commanders. The lucky ones had access to physicians who had received formal training at medieval universities, where they learned to diagnose illnesses by examining urine samples and treat diseases by adjusting the balance of bodily humors. The unlucky ones had to rely on local healers whose medical knowledge had been passed down through oral tradition and practical experience. To be fair, some medieval medical practitioners were genuinely skilled at treating common injuries and illnesses. They had developed effective techniques for setting broken bones, treating wounds, and managing pain. But their understanding of infection, disease transmission, and surgical procedures was limited by the scientific knowledge available at the time. Meanwhile, the medieval approach to pain management was basically drink alcohol and pray to God. Effective anesthetics didn't exist, so surgical procedures were performed on conscious patients who were held down by assistants while the surgeon worked as quickly as possible. Infection control consisted of maybe washing the instruments between patients, and postoperative care involved hoping the patient's constitution was strong enough to survive both the original injury and the treatment. By the 13th century, medical care had become somewhat more sophisticated, but it was still based on theoretical frameworks that bore little resemblance to modern medical science. Physicians believed that illness was caused by imbalances in the four bodily humors, that the position of the stars influenced health outcomes, and that many diseases could be cured by purging the body of excess blood, bile, or phlegm. If you thought modern medical bills were expensive, imagine paying medieval prices for treatments that were more likely to kill you than cure you. Medical care was a luxury item that only the wealthy could afford, and even then, you were essentially paying premium prices for what amounted to educated guesswork combined with religious ritual. And yet, knight commanders who survived serious injuries often developed remarkable resilience and pain tolerance. They learned to function with disabilities that would sideline modern athletes, to manage chronic pain without effective medications, and to continue their military careers despite physical limitations that would qualify them for disability benefits in any modern society. Still, the psychological impact of medieval medical trauma was something that nobody talked about but everyone experienced. Modern research on PTSD has shown us how profoundly traumatic experiences can affect mental health. But medieval knight commanders were expected to simply tough it out and get back to work regardless of their psychological state. Of course, medieval society did recognize some forms of mental distress, but they were typically attributed to spiritual rather than medical causes. A knight commander who was struggling with what we would now recognize as depression or anxiety was more likely to be diagnosed with possession by demons or punishment for sin than with a treatable medical condition. The successful knight commanders learned to cope with both physical disabilities and psychological trauma through a combination of alcohol, religion, and what we would now recognize as unhealthy coping mechanisms. They developed personal philosophies that allowed them to function despite chronic pain, disability, and emotional distress. Let us be honest about the cumulative impact of medieval military medicine on knight commanders' quality of life. These were men who carried the physical and psychological scars of their profession for the rest of their lives. They lived with chronic pain, limited mobility, and the constant awareness that their bodies had been permanently damaged by their career choices. To be fair, some knight commanders did manage to maintain relatively good health throughout their careers. These were typically individuals who were either extraordinarily lucky, exceptionally skilled at avoiding serious injury, or wealthy enough to afford the best available medical care when they did get hurt. Meanwhile, the families of knight commanders had to deal with the emotional and financial costs of caring for men who had been physically and psychologically damaged by their military service. Wives became caregivers for husbands who might be permanently disabled or suffering from what we would now recognize as traumatic brain injuries. Children grew up with fathers who were in chronic pain or dealing with untreated psychological trauma. By the time a knight commander reached middle age, he had typically accumulated a collection of injuries and disabilities that would qualify him for a handicap packing permit in any modern jurisdiction. But medieval society expected him to continue functioning at full capacity, regardless of his physical limitations. If you thought modern veterans' healthcare was inadequate, imagine trying to access medical services in an era where the concept of occupational disability did not exist and wounded soldiers were expected to either recover completely or die gracefully without becoming a burden on society. And yet, some knight commanders did receive ongoing support from their lords or from religious institutions that cared for disabled veterans. The more successful ones had accumulated enough wealth during their careers to pay for private medical care, though the quality of that care was limited by the medical knowledge available at the time. Still, the majority of injured knight commanders had to rely on family members for long-term care and support. This created significant financial and emotional burdens for families who were already struggling with the costs and uncertainties of military life. Of course, the medical challenges weren't limited to battle injuries. Knight commanders also had to deal with the various diseases and health problems that were common in medieval society. Plague outbreaks could devastate military units. Poor sanitation led to frequent outbreaks of dysentery and other gastrointestinal diseases. Malnutrition weakened immune systems and made soldiers more vulnerable to infection. The smart knight commanders learned basic field, medicine, and public health practices that could help keep their units healthy and combat ready. They understood that disease could be more destructive to military effectiveness than enemy action, and they tried to implement preventive measures when possible. Let's be clear about the level of medical knowledge required for effective medieval military leadership. Knight commanders needed to understand wound treatment, recognize the symptoms of common diseases, know how to prevent the spread of infection in close quarters, and be able to make decisions about when injured soldiers should be returned to duty versus when they should be retired from service. To be fair, this medical knowledge was entirely practical and experience-based. Knight commanders learned through trial and error, often at considerable cost in terms of human suffering and military effectiveness. But those who survived long enough to accumulate experience often became quite skilled at military medicine within the limitations of medieval medical knowledge. Meanwhile, the psychological aspects of medical leadership were just as important as the technical knowledge. Knight commanders had to maintain morale among men who were dealing with pain, disability, and the constant threat of serious injury or death. They had to make difficult decisions about resource allocation when medical supplies were limited and demand was high. By the late medieval period, the more sophisticated military units had developed systematic approaches to battlefield medicine and soldier care. They had medical personnel, supply systems, and evacuation procedures that represented significant improvements over earlier practices, though they were still primitive by modern standards. If you thought modern military medicine was impressive, you'd be amazed by what medieval knight commanders achieved with the limited resources and knowledge available to them. They developed innovative techniques for treating battlefield injuries, managing pain, and maintaining the health of military units under extremely difficult conditions. And yet, even the best medieval military medicine couldn't overcome the fundamental limitations of pre-modern medical knowledge. Knight commanders and their subordinates continued to die from injuries and diseases that would be easily treatable today, and those who survived often carried permanent disabilities that profoundly affected their quality of life. Still, the medical challenges of medieval military service did produce some genuine innovations and improvements in medical practice. Military surgeons developed new techniques for treating battlefield injuries. The practical experience of caring for large numbers of wounded soldiers led to improvements in surgical procedures and wound treatment. Of course, these medical advances came at an enormous human cost. Every innovation in medieval military medicine was purchased with the suffering and death of countless soldiers who served as unwitting test subjects for experimental treatments and procedures. The knight commanders who survived their medical ordeals often became advocates for better medical care and support for military personnel. They understood, from personal experience, the importance of medical preparedness and the costs of inadequate health care for military units. Let us be honest, the medical realities of medieval military service would be considered unacceptable by any modern standard. The combination of dangerous working conditions, inadequate medical care, and limited understanding of disease and injury created a healthcare crisis that affected every aspect of military operations. To be fair, medieval knight commanders and their contemporaries were doing the best they could with the knowledge and resources available to them. They developed creative solutions to medical problems and showed remarkable resilience in the face of physical and psychological trauma. Meanwhile, their experiences contributed to the gradual improvement of medical knowledge and practice that would eventually lead to modern medicine. The lessons learned from treating battlefield injuries and managing the health of military units provided valuable information that was passed down to future generations of medical practitioners. By the end of the medieval period, military medicine had evolved into a more sophisticated discipline that incorporated lessons learned from centuries of warfare and medical practice. But even these improvements were limited by the fundamental constraints of pre-modern medical knowledge and technology. Chapter 5. The Spiritual Burden. Let's talk about the religious responsibilities of being a knight commander, because apparently, it wasn't enough to manage armed psychopaths and navigate deadly politics. You also had to serve as a part-time priest, moral authority, and spiritual counselor to men whose idea of religious devotion was praying to God for the strength to kill their enemies more efficiently. Sound familiar? It's like being asked to run a modern corporation while also serving as the company chaplain, except your employees were professional killers and your corporate mission statement was spread Christianity through strategic violence and aggressive marketing. That's right, medieval knight commanders were expected to be simultaneously military leaders and spiritual guides. Because the medieval mind saw no contradiction between serving the Prince of Peace and spending your career figuring out creative ways to turn other human beings into hamburger meat. The cognitive dissonance would have driven modern psychologists to drink, but medieval knight commanders just called it Tuesday. Meanwhile, the church had developed an elaborate theological framework that not only justified but actually encouraged Christian knights to engage in what would otherwise be considered mass murder. The concept of just war was essentially a religious permission slip that allowed you to kill people while maintaining your spiritual purity, as long as you were killing the right people for the right reasons with the right attitude. By the time you became a knight commander, you had typically spent years learning to reconcile the peaceful teachings of Jesus Christ with the practical requirements of professional violence. This required a level of mental gymnastics that would impress modern politicians, combined with a sincere religious faith that somehow remained intact, despite being stretched to cover activities that would make modern war crimes tribunals reach for their indictment forms. If you thought modern religious hypocrisy was impressive, think again. Medieval knight commanders managed to maintain genuine spiritual devotion while simultaneously planning military campaigns that involved burning entire cities, enslaving civilian populations, and implementing siege tactics that would make modern terrorists look like humanitarian aid workers. And yet, this wasn't considered hypocrisy by medieval standards. The church taught that violence in service of God was not just acceptable, but actually spiritually beneficial. Knight commanders were told that dying in battle against infidels would guarantee them immediate entry into paradise, which was essentially the medieval equivalent of a military life insurance policy with eternal benefits. Still, let's examine the specific spiritual responsibilities that came with military leadership. Knight commanders were expected to lead prayers before battles, provide spiritual guidance to subordinates, ensure that military operations were conducted according to Christian principles, and maintain their own spiritual purity despite being surrounded by the kind of violence that would give modern peace activists nervous breakdowns. Of course, Christian principles in medieval military context meant something quite different from what modern Christians might expect. Medieval military ethics allowed for practices that included taking hostages, demanding ransom payments, executing prisoners under certain circumstances, and implementing collective punishment against civilian populations that supported enemy forces. Let's be clear about the theological complexities involved in medieval military chaplaincy. Knight commanders had to provide spiritual comfort to men who were about to risk their lives in battle, while also preparing them mentally for the possibility that they might need to commit acts of violence that would traumatize modern soldiers despite their advanced psychological training. To be fair, some knight commanders did genuinely struggle with the moral implications of their profession. They sought guidance from religious authorities, engaged in intensive spiritual practices, and tried to minimize unnecessary violence while still fulfilling their military obligations. But they were operating within a cultural and theological framework that provided religious justification for activities that modern ethics would condemn. Meanwhile, the Crusades had created additional layers of spiritual complexity for knight commanders. Military service against Muslim forces was not just politically and economically motivated. It was presented as a form of pilgrimage that could earn spiritual benefits equivalent to the most rigorous religious observances. By the 12th century, knight commanders leading crusade forces were essentially religious entrepreneurs, offering their subordinates the opportunity to earn salvation through military service while simultaneously advancing their own political and economic interests. It was like running a medieval MLM scheme where the product was eternal salvation and the marketing strategy involved conquering Jerusalem. If you thought modern televangelists were creative in their fundraising techniques, imagine trying to raise money for military campaigns by promising potential investors that financial contributions to the war effort would be rewarded with reduced time in purgatory and preferential treatment in the afterlife. And yet, many knight commanders seemed to genuinely believe in the spiritual benefits of their military service. They maintained elaborate religious rituals, supported religious institutions, and structured their personal lives around spiritual practices that were intended to keep them in good standing with God, despite their professional involvement in organized violence. Still, the psychological costs of trying to maintain spiritual purity while engaging in military leadership were enormous. Knight commanders had to find ways to reconcile their religious beliefs with the practical demands of warfare. And this often required forms of mental compartmentalization that would be considered unhealthy by modern psychological standards. Of course, the Church provided extensive guidance on how to manage these spiritual challenges. Religious authorities developed detailed theories about when violence was justified, how much violence was acceptable, what kinds of violence were spiritually beneficial versus spiritually harmful, and what kinds of penance were required for different categories of military action. The successful knight commanders learned to navigate these complex theological frameworks while maintaining their effectiveness as military leaders. They became experts in medieval moral theology, not because they were particularly scholarly, but because their spiritual and professional survival depended on understanding the religious rules that governed their profession. Let's be honest about the impact of these religious responsibilities on military effectiveness. Knight commanders who took their spiritual duties seriously often found themselves dealing with moral conflicts that could compromise their ability to make hard decisions quickly and effectively in combat situations. To be fair, Religious training also provided valuable leadership tools for managing medieval military units. Shared religious beliefs created unit cohesion. Spiritual rituals helped maintain morale, and the promise of spiritual rewards for military service motivated soldiers to take risks they might otherwise avoid. Meanwhile, the knight commanders who became most successful at integrating religious and military leadership often developed personal theologies that emphasized the compatibility between Christian virtue and military effectiveness. They convinced themselves and their subordinates that being a good Christian and being a good soldier were not just compatible but mutually reinforcing. By the 13th century, military religious practices had become highly sophisticated, with elaborate rituals for blessing weapons, consecrating military campaigns, providing spiritual preparation for battle, and offering religious comfort to dying soldiers. Knight commanders were expected to be fluent in all these practices and capable of adapting them to different military situations. If you thought modern military chaplains had a difficult job, imagine trying to provide spiritual guidance in an era where the dominant theology actively encouraged holy war and presented military violence as a form of religious devotion. The moral framework was completely different from anything a modern military chaplain would recognize. And yet, some knight commanders did develop genuinely sophisticated approaches to military spirituality that provided real comfort and guidance to their subordinates. They found ways to emphasize the protective and comforting aspects of religious faith while downplaying the more problematic theological justifications for violence. Still, the majority of knight commanders probably approached their spiritual responsibilities as another aspect of military leadership rather than as a genuine religious calling. They learned to perform the required rituals and provide the expected spiritual guidance because it was part of their job, not necessarily because they had deep theological insight or strong personal faith. Of course, this instrumental approach to religious leadership created its own problems. Subordinates could often tell the difference between genuine spiritual authority and mere ritual performance, and knight commanders who failed to project authentic religious conviction often struggled with morale and discipline problems. The smart knight commanders understood that effective spiritual leadership required more than just going through the motions of religious observance. They had to project genuine faith and moral authority, which meant either developing authentic religious conviction or becoming very good at faking it convincingly. Let us be clear about the long-term psychological impact of trying to maintain spiritual leadership while engaging in professional violence. Many knight commanders developed religious obsessions, scrupulosity, and other forms of psychological dysfunction as they struggled to reconcile their spiritual responsibilities with their military activities. To be fair, medieval religious culture provided more support for this kind of psychological integration than modern secular culture might. The theological framework for just war, the spiritual benefits of military service, and the religious community's acceptance of holy violence all helped knight commanders maintain their spiritual identity while pursuing military careers. Meanwhile, the religious aspects of military leadership often provided the most meaningful and lasting satisfaction in knight commanders' careers. Men who might otherwise have seen themselves as professional killers could instead view themselves as servants of God engaged in holy work that had eternal significance. By the late medieval period, the integration of religious and military culture had produced a distinctive form of Christian warrior spirituality that emphasized personal devotion, military virtue, and service to God through service to earthly lords. This spiritual framework provided psychological support for generations of knight commanders. If you thought modern military culture struggled with questions about the morality of warfare, imagine trying to resolve these issues in an era where the dominant religious authority actively promoted military violence as a form of spiritual discipline and religious devotion. And yet, even within this framework, individual knight commanders had to work out their own personal approaches to the moral and spiritual challenges of their profession. They had to decide for themselves how to balance mercy with military necessity, how to treat enemies and prisoners, and how to maintain their spiritual integrity while fulfilling their professional obligations. Still, the religious framework did provide clear guidelines for many of these decisions. Medieval military ethics, as developed by church authorities, offered specific guidance on treatment of prisoners, conduct during sieges, appropriate levels of violence, and proper spiritual preparation for military action. Of course, these guidelines were often ignored in the heat of battle or when military necessity seemed to require actions that violated religious principles. Knight commanders had to decide for themselves when spiritual concerns should override military considerations, and these decisions often had significant consequences for both their careers and their consciences. The successful knight commanders were those who found ways to maintain their spiritual integrity while still being effective military leaders. They learned to make hard decisions quickly, while also taking responsibility for the moral and spiritual consequences of their actions. Let us be honest, the spiritual burden of medieval military leadership was unlike anything faced by modern military officers. The combination of religious responsibility, moral authority, and professional violence created psychological pressures that would challenge anyone's mental health and spiritual stability. To be fair, the medieval cultural framework provided more support for managing these pressures than might be available in modern secular military organizations. The religious community understood and accepted the spiritual challenges of military leadership, and they provided theological resources for addressing these challenges. Meanwhile, the spiritual aspects of military service often provided the most enduring meaning and satisfaction in knight commanders' careers. Men who might otherwise have struggled to find purpose in professional violence could instead see their military service as part of a larger, spiritual mission that gave their lives eternal significance. By the end of their careers, many knight commanders had developed sophisticated personal theologies that helped them make sense of their life experiences and maintain their spiritual integrity, despite the moral compromises required by their profession. These personal spiritual frameworks often became sources of wisdom and guidance for younger generations of military leaders. Chapter 6. Family life? What family life? Let's discuss the work-life balance of medieval knight commanders, a concept so foreign to the medieval mind that they would have assumed work-life balance with some kind of exotic foreign philosophy, like personal hygiene or not dying horribly from preventable diseases. Sound familiar? It is exactly like those modern jobs that claim to offer flexible scheduling and family-friendly policies while actually expecting you to be available 24/7 for whatever crisis du jour requires your immediate attention. Except instead of answering emails at midnight, you are expected to ride off to war at a moment's notice and might not come back for months, years, or ever. That's right. Being a knight commander was the original, always-on profession, long before smartphones made it impossible to escape work demands. The difference was that when your medieval boss called, he wasn't asking you to review a PowerPoint presentation. He was ordering you to gather your men and march off to kill someone, quite possibly getting yourself killed in the process. Meanwhile, the concept of family time was about as relevant to medieval knight commanders as casual Friday or mental health days. Your family time was whatever time remained after you had fulfilled your military obligations, political responsibilities, economic duties, and spiritual requirements, which, if you were lucky, might amount to a few weeks between campaigns and a couple hours between crises. By the time you achieved knight commander status, you had typically already sacrificed most of your 20s to military training and early career advancement, which meant that you were starting your family life at an age when most modern people are already dealing with midlife crises and wondering where their youth went. If you thought modern dual career couples face scheduling challenges, think again. Medieval knight commanders married women who understood from the beginning that their husband's primary loyalty was to their lord, not to their family, and that military service would always take priority over domestic concerns, children's needs, and marital happiness. And yet, marriage was often essential for a knight commander's career advancement. The right marriage could provide political connections, economic resources, and social legitimacy that were crucial for professional success. But these strategic marriages were business arrangements first and romantic relationships second, if they were romantic relationships at all. Still, let's examine what family life actually looked like for a successful knight commander. First, there was the issue of housing. Military leaders needed residences that could function simultaneously as family homes, military headquarters, administrative centers, and defensive fortifications. Medieval architecture reflected these multiple requirements, creating living spaces that were about as conducive to family intimacy as modern office buildings. Of course, privacy was a concept that hadn't been invented yet. Medieval noble households were essentially small communities where dozens or hundreds of people lived, worked, and socialized in close quarters. The knight commander who wanted to have a private conversation with his wife had to compete for space and attention. With servants, guards, guests, administrative staff, and various hangers-on who treated his home like a combination hotel, restaurant, and entertainment venue. Let's be clear about the parenting responsibilities of knight commanders. Medieval fathers were expected to provide for their children's physical needs, arrange appropriate marriages or career opportunities, and ensure that their sons received proper military training. But day-to-day childcare was considered women's work, and emotional bonding between fathers and children was not considered particularly important or desirable. To be fair, this emotional distance was partly a psychological survival mechanism. Knight commanders who allowed themselves to become too emotionally attached to their children risked being paralyzed by concern for their families' welfare when military duties required them to take risks that could leave their children fatherless and financially ruined. Meanwhile, the children of knight commanders grew up in an environment where violence was normalized. Political instability was constant, and their father's absence was more common than his presence. These children learned early that their family, security, and social status depended entirely on their father's continued success in an extremely dangerous profession. By the 13th century, the demands of military service had become so intensive that many knight commanders spent more time away from home than they spent with their families. Campaign seasons that lasted for months, garrison duties that required extended residence at remote fortifications, and corps obligations that demanded frequent travel meant that successful military leaders were essentially part-time husbands and fathers. If you thought modern business travel was hard on family relationships, imagine being away from home for 6 months at a time with no communication. Technology more advanced than letters carried by messengers who might be killed by bandits before reaching their destination. And yet, some knight commanders did manage to maintain strong family relationships despite the demands of their profession. These were typically men who had achieved enough success and security to have some control over their schedules, or who had married exceptionally capable women who could manage family affairs independently during their husbands' frequent absences. Still, even the most successful family relationships were shaped by the brutal realities of medieval military life. Wives of knight commanders learned to live with the constant possibility that their husband might not return from his next campaign, and they had to be prepared to manage family affairs, raise children, and maintain household security as single parents for extended periods. Of course, the wives of knight commanders weren't just passive victims of their husbands' career choices. Many of these women were formidable individuals in their own right, who wielded considerable political and economic influence. They managed estates, negotiated business deals, arranged marriages for their children, and sometimes even commanded military forces when circumstances required it. The smart knight commanders understood that their professional success depended heavily on their wives' competence and support. A knight commander married to an incompetent or uncooperative woman faced severe disadvantages in managing his career, while one married to a capable and supportive partner had significant advantages in navigating the complex demands of medieval military leadership. Let's be honest about the emotional costs of these arrangements for everyone involved. Knight commanders who spent their careers moving between battlefields, court obligations, and administrative responsibilities often became emotionally disconnected from their families. They learned to suppress feelings that might interfere with their professional effectiveness, which often made them difficult husbands and fathers, even when they were physically present. To be fair, medieval culture didn't expect the kind of emotional intimacy and companionship that modern marriages are supposed to provide. Marriage was primarily an economic and political arrangement, and personal happiness was considered less important than family security and social stability. But this didn't mean that medieval couples were incapable of developing genuine affection and mutual support. Meanwhile, the children of knight commanders often developed complex relationships with fathers who were simultaneously heroic figures and distant strangers. These children grew up hearing stories about their father's military achievements while rarely seeing him in person, which created a kind of celebrity worship dynamic that could be psychologically confusing for everyone involved. By the time a knight commander's children reached adulthood, they had typically spent more time with their mother, tutors, and household staff than with their father. This emotional distance was considered normal and even desirable by medieval standards, but it often created family dynamics that would seem dysfunctional by modern standards. If you thought modern teenagers had complicated relationships with their parents, imagine growing up as the child of someone whose primary identity was as a professional killer, whose social status was based on his ability to organize violence effectively, and whose career required him to risk his life regularly in service of political causes you might not understand or support. And yet, many knight commanders did develop strong bonds with their children, particularly with sons who were expected to follow in their father's footsteps. The process of training young men for military careers often provided opportunities for father-son bonding that were otherwise rare in medieval noble families. Still, the pressure of living up to a successful father's reputation could be overwhelming for the sons of famous knight commanders. These young men faced expectations that they would match or exceed their father's achievements, often without receiving the same level of training, support, or opportunity that had enabled their father's success. Of course, daughters of knight commanders faced their own unique challenges. They were raised to be political assets who could be married off to create useful alliances. But they also often inherited their father's intelligence, ambition, and leadership abilities without having socially acceptable outlets for these traits. The successful knight commanders learned to view their family relationships as another aspect of their professional responsibilities. They understood that their children's marriages, their wives' political connections, and their household's reputation all contributed to their own career advancement and social standing. Let's be clear about the long-term impact of medieval military careers on family relationships. Knight commanders who survived to old age often found themselves emotionally isolated from family members who had learned to function independently during their frequent absences. The men who had spent their careers leading other men often struggled to connect with their own families. To be fair, some knight commanders did successfully transition from military leadership to family patriarch roles later in life. These men often became valued advisors to their adult children and respected figures in their local communities. But this transition required psychological adjustments that not all military leaders could make successfully. Meanwhile, the families of knight commanders often developed their own internal power structures and relationship dynamics that reflected the absent father's influence, while also compensating for his physical and emotional unavailability. These family systems could be remarkably resilient and effective, but they were often quite different from families where the father was more consistently present and engaged. By the late medieval period, some knight commanders were beginning to prioritize family relationships more highly and to seek ways to balance military obligations with domestic responsibilities. But these changes were gradual and often limited to the most successful and secure military leaders. If you thought modern work-life balance was a recent concern, you'd be surprised to learn that some medieval knight commanders did struggle with similar issues. They wanted to be good fathers and husbands while also fulfilling their professional obligations, and they often found these goals difficult to reconcile. And yet, the cultural framework for addressing these conflicts was very different from modern approaches. Medieval society expected men to prioritize their public duties over their private desires. And knight commanders who seemed too focused on family concerns risked being seen as weak or uncommitted to their professional responsibilities. Still, some knight commanders did find creative ways to integrate family life with military careers. They brought family members on certain campaigns, involved wives in military planning and logistics, and created household arrangements that allowed for more family interaction despite professional demands. Of course, these arrangements were only possible for knight commanders who had achieved enough success and security to have some control over their circumstances. The majority of military leaders had to accept whatever family life was compatible with their professional obligations and hoped that their families would understand and adapt to the constraints of military service. The smart knight commanders understood that their families' support and understanding were crucial for their long-term success and happiness. They invested time and effort in maintaining family relationships when possible, and they tried to ensure that their professional achievements translated into tangible benefits for their family members. Let's be honest about the generational impact of medieval military careers on noble families. The children and grandchildren of knight commanders often inherited not just wealth and social status, but also psychological patterns and family dynamics that reflected their ancestors' military service and its effects on family relationships. To be fair, many knight commanders were genuinely devoted to their families and tried to be good husbands and fathers within the constraints of their professional obligations. They provided financial security, social status, and protection for their family members, even if they couldn't provide consistent emotional availability and domestic stability. Meanwhile, the wives and children of knight commanders often developed remarkable resilience and independence as they learned to manage family affairs without consistent paternal presence and support. These family members often became formidable individuals in their own right, capable of handling complex responsibilities and difficult circumstances. By the end of their careers, successful knight commanders often took great pride in their family's achievements and social advancement. They saw their children's marriages, careers, and social status as validation of their own life choices and professional sacrifices. Chapter 7. The Technology Gap. Let's talk about technological disruption in medieval warfare. Because apparently, it wasn't enough for knight commanders to deal with political backstabbing, financial ruin, and medical horrors. They also had to cope with the medieval equivalent of having their entire industry automated out of existence by some upstart engineers who thought they could improve on 1,000 years of military tradition. Sound familiar? It's exactly like those modern industries that got completely revolutionized by digital technology, except instead of worrying about whether AI would replace your job, knight commanders had to worry about whether crossbows, gunpowder, and professional infantry would make their expensive cavalry-based business model completely obsolete. That's right. Knight commanders were essentially the medieval equivalent of taxi drivers watching Uber destroy their industry, or retail managers watching Amazon eliminate brick-and-mortar stores. Except the disruption was happening with weapons specifically designed to turn heavily armored nobles into very expensive corpses. Meanwhile, the military-industrial complex of medieval Europe was experiencing the kind of rapid technological change that would make modern Silicon Valley executives dizzy. New weapons, new tactics, new fortification designs, and new military organizational structures were appearing faster than established military leaders could adapt to them. By the 13th century, knight commanders who had spent their entire careers mastering the art of heavy cavalry warfare were discovering that their core competencies were becoming increasingly irrelevant in conflicts dominated by crossbowmen, pikemen, and siege engineers who could kill experienced knights from distances. That made traditional martial training almost meaningless. If you thought keeping up with modern technology was exhausting, imagine trying to adapt to military innovations when your previous investment in training and equipment represented decades of your life and most of your family's wealth, and when failure to adapt quickly enough could result in your literal death, rather than just professional embarrassment. And yet, the most successful knight commanders were those who recognized these technological trends early and found ways to integrate new military technologies with traditional leadership skills. They became early adopters who could combine conventional military wisdom with innovative, tactical approaches. Still, let's examine the specific technological challenges that transformed medieval warfare during the knight commander era. First, there was the rise of professional infantry units that could hold their ground against cavalry charges using coordinated pike formations, crossbow volleys, and disciplined defensive tactics. Of course, these infantry innovations didn't just change battlefield tactics. They fundamentally altered the economics of medieval warfare. Professional foot soldiers were cheaper to equip and train than heavy cavalry, which meant that rulers could field larger armies at lower costs while reducing their dependence on the feudal military service of noble knights. Let's be clear about what this meant for knight commanders who had built their careers around heavy cavalry tactics. Suddenly, the military skills that had taken decades to develop were being countered by peasant soldiers with a few months of training and weapons that cost a fraction of a knight's equipment. To be fair, cavalry remained important throughout the medieval period, and skilled knight commanders continued to find ways to use mounted forces effectively, even as battlefield tactics evolved. But they had to learn to work with combined arms forces that included infantry, archers, and siege specialists rather than relying primarily on cavalry charges. Meanwhile, the development of more effective siege warfare technology was making traditional castle-based defensive strategies increasingly obsolete. Knight commanders who had spent their careers learning to attack and defend fortifications discovered that new siege engines, mining techniques, and eventually gunpowder weapons could reduce supposedly impregnable castles to rubble in weeks rather than months or years. By the 14th century, the introduction of early firearms was beginning to revolutionize battlefield tactics in ways that made traditional armor and cavalry charges not just ineffective, but actively suicidal. A knight commander who charged a line of disciplined infantry, armed with pikes and firearms, was essentially committing very expensive suicide while taking his subordinates along for the ride. If you thought modern professionals struggled with technological obsolescence, imagine discovering that the skills you had spent your entire adult life developing were not just becoming less valuable, but were actually making you more vulnerable to enemies who had embraced newer, cheaper, and more effective military technologies. And yet, some knight commanders successfully adapted to these technological changes by becoming military entrepreneurs who specialized in integrating new technologies with traditional military leadership. They learned to command mixed forces that included both traditional knights and newer military specialties. Still, the psychological impact of technological disruption on knight commanders was enormous. These were men whose entire identity was built around mastery of specific military skills, and watching those skills become obsolete was like watching their entire sense of self-worth dissolve in real time. Of course, the most adaptive knight commanders found ways to leverage their leadership, experience, and political connections, even as their specific military skills became less relevant. They became military contractors, administrative officials, and strategic advisors who applied their knowledge of warfare and politics to new technological contexts. The smart ones understood that technological change was inevitable and that their survival depended on their ability to learn new skills, while maintaining their core competencies in leadership and military organization. They became lifelong learners out of necessity, constantly adapting to new weapons, tactics, and organizational structures. Let's be honest about the generational conflicts that technological change created within medieval military hierarchies. Older knight commanders who had achieved success with traditional methods often resisted innovations that threatened their expertise and authority, while younger military leaders embraced new technologies that could accelerate their career advancement. To be fair, some resistance to military innovation was justified by practical concerns. New technologies weren't always more effective than established methods, and premature adoption of unproven weapons or tactics could be disastrous in real combat situations. Experienced knight commanders had learned to be skeptical of military fads and innovations that looked impressive in training but failed under battlefield conditions. Meanwhile, the pace of technological change was accelerating throughout the late medieval period, which meant that knight commanders who had successfully adapted to one wave of innovation often found themselves facing additional technological disruptions before they had fully mastered the previous changes. By the 15th century, military technology was evolving so rapidly that knight commanders needed to be constantly learning new skills and adapting to new tactical doctrines. The static military knowledge that had served earlier generations was no longer sufficient for professional survival. If you thought modern continuing education requirements were burdensome, imagine having to master new military technologies while also maintaining your existing responsibilities for leading men in life-and-death situations where technological ignorance could result in catastrophic defeats and mass casualties. And yet, the knight commanders who thrived during periods of rapid technological change often became the most innovative and effective military leaders of their era. They learned to think strategically about technology adoption, to experiment with new tactical approaches, and to integrate diverse military capabilities into coherent operational strategies. Still, even successful adaptation to technological change came with significant costs. Knight commanders who invested heavily in new military technologies often found that their innovations became obsolete before they could fully recoup their investments, creating a cycle of constant expense and technological uncertainty. Of course, technological disruption also created new opportunities for ambitious knight commanders who were willing to embrace change. Military leaders who became early experts in new technologies could command premium compensation and achieve rapid career advancement by solving problems that traditional approaches couldn't address. The most successful technological adapters learned to balance innovation with proven methods, incorporating new capabilities without abandoning the leadership skills and military wisdom that remained valuable regardless of specific technologies. They became hybrid leaders who could operate effectively in both traditional and innovative military contexts. Let's be clear about the broader strategic implications of technological change for medieval military organizations. Knight commanders had to learn to think not just tactically, but also strategically about how technological innovations would affect the balance of power between different military forces and political entities. To be fair, some knight commanders became genuine military innovators who contributed to technological development rather than just adapting to changes created by others. They worked with weaponsmiths, siege engineers, and other technical specialists to develop new military capabilities and tactical approaches. Meanwhile, the integration of new military technologies often required knight commanders to develop new organizational skills and management approaches. Leading combined arms forces with diverse technological capabilities required different leadership techniques than commanding traditional cavalry units taught by the late medieval period. The most successful knight commanders were essentially military systems integrators who could coordinate between different technical specialists while maintaining overall strategic focus and operational effectiveness. They had become technology managers rather than just warrior leaders. If you thought modern project management was complex, imagine trying to coordinate between cavalry units, infantry formations, artillery specialists, siege engineers, logistics, personnel, and intelligence operatives using only medieval communication technology and organizational methods. And yet, some knight commanders did master these complex organizational challenges and became renowned for their ability to integrate diverse military capabilities into effective operational strategies. They were the medieval equivalent of modern military officers who specialize in joint operations and combined arms warfare. Still, the constant pressure of technological adaptation took a toll on knight commanders' personal lives and psychological well-being. Men who had achieved mastery in one area were constantly having to become beginners again as military technology evolved, which required a level of intellectual humility and adaptability that not all military leaders possessed. Of course, technological change also affected the broader social and economic context within which knight commanders operated. New military technologies changed the relative importance of different social classes, altered the economic basis of military service, and created new forms of political power that challenged traditional feudal relationships. The knight commanders, who understood these broader implications of technological change, were better positioned to navigate the political and economic changes that accompanied military innovation. They could anticipate how new technologies would affect their relationships with lords, subordinates, and rival military leaders. Let's be honest about the ultimate impact of technological disruption on the medieval knight commander profession. By the end of the medieval period, the job had been fundamentally transformed from a primarily cavalry-based role to a much more complex position that required expertise in multiple military technologies and organizational approaches. To be fair, this transformation wasn't entirely negative. The knight commanders who successfully adapted to technological change often became more effective military leaders than their predecessors, capable of achieving strategic objectives that would have been impossible using only traditional methods. Meanwhile, the skills that successful knight commanders developed in managing technological change, adaptability, strategic thinking, systems integration, and innovation management became valuable in many other areas of medieval society beyond purely military applications. By the end of the medieval period, former knight commanders were often found in positions as administrators, diplomats, merchants, and technical advisors, where their experience with managing complex organizational and technological challenges proved extremely valuable. Chapter 8. The Endgame. Let's talk about career endings for medieval knight commanders, because apparently nobody in the Middle Ages had heard of 401k plans, pension systems, or the radical concept that people who had spent their lives in dangerous professions deserve to retire with dignity and financial security. Sound familiar? It's exactly like those modern companies that promise generous retirement benefits while systematically finding ways to eliminate positions just before employees become eligible for full pensions, except instead of corporate restructuring. Medieval knight commanders faced the constant threat of death, disability, political purges, and the occasional creative execution. That's right. The medieval retirement system was essentially keep working until you die, become too disabled to function, or make someone angry enough to have you killed. There was no graceful exit strategy, no phased retirement program, and definitely no company golf tournaments to mark your transition from productive contributor to respected emeritus. Meanwhile, the few knight commanders who did survive long enough to consider retirement faced the unpleasant discovery that their skill set, which primarily consisted of organizing violence, managing armed psychopaths, and navigating deadly political situations, wasn't particularly transferable to peaceful civilian occupations. By the time a knight commander reached his 50s, which was already beating the actuarial odds by a considerable margin, he had typically accumulated enough physical disabilities, psychological trauma, and political enemies to make continued military service both difficult and dangerous. But he had also accumulated financial obligations and family responsibilities that made retirement financially impossible. If you thought modern retirement planning was stressful, imagine trying to figure out your post-career options when your primary assets were your reputation for violence, your collection of increasingly obsolete weapons, and your ability to inspire loyalty in men who were now either dead or serving younger commanders who hadn't yet gotten everyone killed. And yet, retirement wasn't always voluntary. Knight commanders who lost political favor, suffered serious injuries, or simply became too old to be effective in combat often found themselves forcibly retired whether they were financially prepared or not. Medieval society had limited patience. Has-beens and yesterday's hero could easily become today's burden. Still, let's examine the specific ways that knight commander careers typically ended. The most common outcome was death in combat, which at least had the advantage of being quick and providing some posthumous glory for the family to remember. These men died doing what they had trained for their entire lives, and their deaths were usually considered honorable and socially valuable. Of course, death in combat wasn't always quick or glorious. Medieval warfare included plenty of opportunities for slow, painful deaths from infected wounds, disease outbreaks, or siege-related starvation. Knight commanders who died from dysentery during a prolonged siege didn't get to enjoy the same posthumous reputation as those who fell heroically in single combat against worthy opponents. Let's be clear about the impact of combat deaths on knight commander families. These deaths often left wives and children in precarious financial and social situations, especially if the knight commander hadn't had time to arrange for their security before his final campaign. Medieval society provided some support for military widows, but it was often inadequate for maintaining the lifestyle that the family had previously enjoyed. To be fair, some knight commanders did die wealthy and successful, leaving behind substantial inheritances that could support their families for generations. But these were the exceptions, and even successful military leaders often discovered that their estates were heavily encumbered by debts and obligations that consumed most of their apparent wealth. Meanwhile, the knight commanders who survived combat often faced equally challenging endings. Serious disabilities from battle wounds could end a military career while leaving the individual alive but unable to support himself or his family through alternative employment. Medieval society had limited resources for supporting disabled veterans, and families often struggled to care for men who had become physical and financial burdens. By the 13th century, some religious institutions had begun providing care for disabled knights and veterans, but these facilities were often overcrowded, underfunded, and focused more on spiritual comfort than on medical care or rehabilitation. A knight commander who ended his career in a monastery infirmary was probably better off than one who had to rely on family charity, but neither option offered much in the way of dignity or comfort. If you thought modern disability benefits were inadequate, imagine trying to navigate medieval social services when your primary qualification was that you had spent your career killing people for money and were no longer physically capable of continuing that work. And yet, some disabled knight commanders did find ways to remain useful and respected despite their physical limitations. They became advisors, administrators, or teachers who could pass on their knowledge and experience to younger generations of military leaders. These positions often provided more security and respect than continued active service, though they typically paid less and offered fewer opportunities for glory and advancement. Still, the most psychologically difficult career endings were probably those that resulted from political disgrace rather than physical incapacity. Knight commanders who fell out of favor with their lords, backed the wrong side in political conflicts, or simply became inconvenient could find themselves stripped of position, property, and social status almost overnight. Of course, political disgrace often led quickly to physical elimination. Medieval rulers had limited tolerance for disgraced military leaders, who might become focal points for opposition or rebellion. The knight commander who lost his lord's favor often had a brief window of opportunity to flee into exile before someone decided that permanent removal would be safer than temporary banishment. The smart knight commanders tried to plan for these possibilities by maintaining multiple sources of support, diversifying their political relationships, and keeping emergency resources available for quick escapes. But even the most careful planning couldn't always protect against the sudden shifts in medieval political fortune that could destroy careers overnight. Let's be honest about the psychological impact of forced career endings on knight commanders. These were men who had built their entire identity around military leadership and martial prowess, and losing that identity often resulted in depression, alcoholism, and other psychological problems that medieval society was poorly equipped to address. To be fair, some knight commanders did successfully reinvent themselves after their military careers ended. They became merchants, diplomats, administrators, or religious leaders who applied their leadership skills and political knowledge to civilian pursuits. But these transitions required psychological flexibility that not all military leaders possessed. Meanwhile, the knight commanders, who managed to achieve something approaching voluntary retirement, often discovered that peacetime life was less satisfying than they had expected. Men who had spent their careers dealing with life and death situations often found civilian concerns trivial and boring, leading to restlessness and dissatisfaction that could persist for years. By the late medieval period, some knight commanders were beginning to plan more systematically for their post-military careers. They accumulated civilian skills, developed alternative income sources, and created social networks that could support them after their fighting days were over. But these approaches required foresight and resources that were not available to most military leaders. If you thought modern career transitions were difficult, imagine trying to change professions when your primary skills involved activities that were illegal in civilian contexts, and your work experience consisted mainly of situations where failure meant death or dismemberment. And yet, the most successful knight commanders often did achieve satisfying post-military careers. They became elder statesmen who were valued for their wisdom and experience, respected community leaders who contributed to local governance and social stability, and family patriarchs who provided guidance and support for younger generations. Still, even the most successful career endings were shaped by the physical and psychological toll of medieval military service. Knight commanders who survived to enjoy retirement typically carried permanent reminders of their military careers in the form of scars, disabilities, and psychological trauma that affected their quality of life and their relationships with family members. Of course, the definition of successful career ending was heavily influenced by medieval values and expectations. A knight commander who died in battle defending his lord's interests might be considered more successful than one who lived to old age, but failed to achieve lasting glory or significant wealth. The families of knight commanders often had different perspectives on what constituted a successful career ending. Wives and children typically preferred outcomes that emphasized family security and patriarch, longevity over military glory and posthumous reputation. But their preferences often had limited influence on the knight commander's own choices about risk-taking and career priorities. Let's be clear about the long-term legacy issues that concerned aging knight commanders. These men wanted to be remembered favorably by history, to leave behind family lines that would honor their memory, and to achieve some form of immortality through their achievements and their descendants. To be fair, many knight commanders did achieve lasting historical recognition for their military service and leadership. They became legendary figures whose stories were told and retold for generations, inspiring future military leaders and contributing to cultural narratives about honor, courage, and service. Meanwhile, the practical concerns of legacy management often dominated the final years of successful knight commanders' careers. They focused on arranging advantageous marriages for their children, establishing foundations or endowments that would preserve their memory, and ensuring that their estates would be managed competently after their deaths. By the end of their careers, most knight commanders had gained enough perspective to understand the costs and benefits of their life choices. They could evaluate their achievements realistically and make informed decisions about how to spend whatever time remained to them. So here we are, at the end of our journey through the spectacular misery of medieval military middle management. And I hope you're feeling appropriately grateful for whatever workplace frustrations you might be dealing with in your modern, air-conditioned, non-lethal professional environment. Let's be clear about what we've discovered here. Being a knight commander in medieval times was essentially like volunteering for the world's most dangerous, financially ruinous, psychologically traumatic internship program, except instead of lasting for a summer, it lasted for your entire adult life, and instead of getting college credit, you got battle scars, chronic pain, and the kind of psychological baggage that would keep modern therapists employed for decades. To be fair, some knight commanders did achieve genuine success, wealth, and historical recognition. But as we've seen, these success stories were the exceptions that proved the rule about how thoroughly awful the job was for the vast majority of people who attempted it. For every legendary military leader whose name we still remember today, there were hundreds of forgotten knights who got chewed up by the brutal machinery of medieval warfare and politics. Meanwhile, the skills and experiences that made someone effective as a medieval knight commander, the ability to make life and death decisions under extreme pressure, the psychological resilience to function in environments of constant violence, the political savvy to navigate deadly court intrigue, were exactly the kinds of capabilities that came at enormous personal cost and often made normal human relationships nearly impossible. By now, you should have a pretty clear understanding of why the romantic mythology of medieval knighthood is about as accurate as a corporate recruitment brochure. The reality was that knight commanders were essentially high-stress middle managers in an industry where poor performance reviews were delivered via executioner's axe and where the retirement plan consisted of "try not to die horribly." If you thought your job was challenging, consider the daily reality of a medieval knight commander, managing a team of armed sociopaths with anger management issues, navigating office politics where your colleagues might literally stab you in the back, dealing with performance pressure where failure meant death rather than just termination, and trying to maintain work-life balance when your work required you to travel extensively to foreign countries for the purpose of killing people. And yet, despite all the obvious drawbacks, thousands of men throughout medieval history pursued these careers with genuine enthusiasm and dedication. They were motivated by ambition, duty, religious conviction, and the hope that they might be among the lucky few who achieved lasting success and recognition. Still, our exploration of medieval knight commander careers offers some interesting parallels to modern professional challenges. The political complexity, the financial pressures, the the work-life balance issues, the healthcare concerns, and the career transition difficulties that plagued medieval military leaders are recognizable to anyone who has navigated modern corporate environments. Of course, the scale and consequences were quite different. Modern middle managers who fail at their jobs typically face career setbacks rather than decapitation, and modern workplace conflicts usually don't involve actual weapons. But the fundamental human challenges of leadership, ambition, and professional survival remain remarkably consistent across the centuries. The knight commanders who succeeded despite these challenges were remarkable individuals who combined military skill, political intelligence, financial acumen, and psychological resilience in ways that enabled them to thrive in one of history's most demanding professional environments. They were, in their own way, the Navy SEALs, Fortune 500 CEOs, and diplomatic corps of their era, except they had to be all three simultaneously while wearing 60 pounds of metal armor. Let's be honest, modern professional life, for all its stresses and challenges, is infinitely more humane, safe, and psychologically sustainable than what medieval knight commanders endured. We have labor laws, healthcare systems, retirement plans, and social safety nets that were unimaginable in medieval times. We can change careers without risking execution, and we can criticize our bosses without facing trial by combat. To be fair, modern life has also lost some things that medieval knight commanders valued. The sense of honor, duty, and service that motivated the best military leaders of the medieval era is often missing from modern corporate culture. The deep personal relationships forged through shared danger and mutual dependence are rare in modern professional environments. Meanwhile, the stories of medieval knight commanders remind us that human beings are capable of extraordinary resilience, courage, and achievement, even under the most difficult circumstances. These men faced challenges that would crush most modern people, and many of them not only survived but thrived, leaving behind legacies that have inspired people for centuries. By studying their experiences, we can gain perspective on our own professional challenges and perhaps develop greater appreciation for the relative safety, security, and opportunity that characterize modern working life. We can also learn from their examples of leadership, resilience, and dedication, even while recognizing the enormous personal costs that their achievements required. Sound familiar? The fundamental human challenges of ambition, leadership, and professional success haven't changed much over the centuries. The tools and context have evolved dramatically. The people are still trying to balance personal happiness with professional achievement, individual needs with collective responsibilities, and short-term survival with long-term legacy. That's right, the medieval knight commanders were dealing with the same basic human dilemmas that continue to challenge modern professionals. They just happened to be doing it in an environment where the stakes were literally life and death, where failure was often fatal, and where success required a combination of skills that would be considered almost superhuman by modern standards. Of course, we shouldn't romanticize their experiences or minimize the genuine suffering and trauma that characterized medieval military careers. These men paid enormous prices for whatever achievements they accomplished, and their families often paid equally high costs for the privileges and status that came with military success. Still, their stories offer valuable lessons about human potential, the costs of ambition, and the complex relationship between personal fulfillment and professional achievement. They remind us that every generation faces its own unique challenges, and that human beings have always found ways to adapt, survive, and occasionally thrive despite difficult circumstances. And yet, perhaps the most important lesson from our exploration of medieval knight commander careers is simply gratitude for the progress that human civilization has made in creating more humane, sustainable, and psychologically healthy approaches to work, leadership, and professional development. So the next time you're frustrated with your boss, stressed about your career prospects, or struggling with work-life balance, take a moment to appreciate the fact that you're not a medieval knight commander trying to manage armed psychopaths while navigating deadly political intrigue in a world where your health insurance plan consisted of pray to God and try not to get stabbed. Meanwhile, remember that the fundamental challenges of leadership, ambition, and professional success remain constant across the centuries. The knight commanders who succeeded did so through dedication, resilience, strategic thinking, and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances, qualities that remain just as valuable in modern professional environments. By understanding their experiences, we can gain perspective on our own challenges and perhaps develop greater appreciation for both the opportunities available to us and the progress that human civilization has made in creating more humane and sustainable approaches to work and professional development. That, my friends, is why it truly, spectacularly, and comprehensively sucked to be a knight commander in medieval times, and why we should all be grateful that we're living in an era where professional middle management rarely involves actual swords, literal backstabbing, or the constant threat of death by creative execution. Let's be honest, modern professional life has its challenges, but at least when your quarterly performance review goes poorly, you don't have to worry about being drawn and quartered in the town square. And that, perhaps, is the most important progress human civilization has made over the past 1,000 years.